Welcome, viewers and listeners, to Island Vibes, a weekly podcast where we look at things Caribbean, the islands, the people, the culture, politics, and way of life. Today, we will be looking at four major issues facing four small islands of the OECS. Issues which tend to significantly impact the citizens of the respective islands, who for days now have been asking questions of the respective leaders, but with no conclusive reassurances to allay their fears, particularly as it relates to these citizens' abilities to travel to the US and maybe soon the UK. And now we're hearing concerns about security at home in the near future. For just the first week of this year, we've had issues being raised with the US taking actions against small OECS islands. In the first week of January 2026, the 1st of January 2026 to be exact, visa restrictions were placed on the islands of Antigua and Dominica, followed by these countries, Antigua and Dominica, along with St. Kitts, agreeing to accept to take in deportees from the US. We have heard too, over the past few days, of travel warnings being issued by the US to their citizens traveling to Grenada. Previously at level 1, the warnings were upgraded to level 2, with Grenada being described as a dangerous place to visit. Now, just days ago, visa bans were announced to take effect later this year on applicants of B1 and B2 visas from Antigua and Dominica. What is the bigger game at play here? Let's get into the four subject matters after this short break. Welcome back. It seems that the Trump administration, in repositioning itself in the Caribbean basin, is punishing the small islands either for the indiscretions of their leaders and respective administrations, their geopolitical relationships, or for some other reasons. And in so doing, the US is forcing the hands of these islands to accept dictates from the US administration. Let's first look at the agreement by the three OECS countries, Antigua, Dominica, and St. Kitts, to accept deportees from the US. The leaders of both Antigua and Dominica, Gaston Browne and Roosevelt Skerrit respectively, informed their citizens that they requested of the US that among those deportees, that there should be no violent individuals. But neither gave any indication as to who these deportees really are or where they would be coming from, as in their original countries of birth. In contrast, the Prime Minister of St. Kitts, Terence Drew, was more specific in that he requested of the US that the deportees be nationals from CARICOM countries only, except those from Haiti. But even with that, the citizens of St. Kitts are outraged, as in the other islands, and the questions across the islands are similar. Where will these deportees live? Where will they be employed? Will they be monitored, and how? What about the security of nationals? On social media, many are expressing their dissatisfaction. In Dominica, for example, many are concerned that the island lacks the adequate resources, infrastructure, and housing to house these deportees, especially while still addressing their own citizens' housing needs. A few posts on social media captured some of those sentiments. One person is quoted as saying, "So it says that an agreement was made to protect Dominica's interests. What interest is that? Are visas more important than the security of the citizens? Why is it their countries of origin of these deportees don't want them back?" And others, "It's not only about sheltering, it's about protecting your people, children, seniors, households, and families. Poor people can't get out. The rich can leave in case of repercussions, and those who are left behind will have to pay the consequences." In St. Kitts, people were calculating the US 5 million or EC 13.5 million payout per 160 individuals as offered to the islands by the US to be roughly EC $84,375 per deportee. Another person in St. Kitts is quoted as saying, "We feed them, house them, provide healthcare, legal aid, mental health services, rehabilitation, and education. Is it for the rest of their lives?" Antiguans too were expressing their views. In referring to the Prime Minister, Gaston Browne, one individual asked, "Is he going to deport them back to the US if they don't abide by the laws of Antigua and Barbuda?" Another is quoted as saying, "With all due respect, sir, this statement sounds like it was written by the US Embassy, where arms were twisted." Across the islands, citizens are alluding to the moral contradiction of St. Kitts' decision, where Haitians fleeing a humanitarian crisis are blacklisted, while deportees from third countries are being accepted into this country. The administrations of Antigua, Dominica, and St. Kitts give no forewarning to their respective citizens the news of an agreement to accept US deportees. And from that, one can conclude that these three countries were given some kind of ultimatum by the US or conditions to make such decisions. Now let's take a look at the travel warnings for Grenada. The US Department of State raised the travel advisory from Grenada to level 2 from level 1, stating that the reason for the status upgrade stems from reports that US citizens in Grenada have been victims of violent crimes, including armed robbery, assault, burglary, and rape. The US government notes that the local police response times may be slower than what is expected in the United States, a totally unreasonable expectation when one considers that the US has far more superior and adequate policing resources than any of these islands. A number of precautionary recommendations were laid out to travelers traveling to Grenada by the US State Department, to include not physically resisting any robbery attempt, taking caution when walking or driving at night, enrolling in the Smart Traveler program to receive emergency updates from the US Embassy, and caution when approached by unfamiliar people or watercraft. This is quite ironic considering that just a few days ago, the police commissioner of that island, Mr. Randy Connor, in giving a summary report of 2025 on the work of the Royal Grenada Police Force, claimed that every single homicide on that island in 2025 was solved, a total of 10 such cases, a minute number in comparison to the neighboring islands. It is indeed a fact that Grenada was one of the first islands to be approached by the US to take in refugees, and they have yet to give confirmation to accepting the same. Is that the US's way of putting pressure on Grenada to accept deportees? Grenada was also asked by the US permission to install radar equipment on that island, another request that they haven't granted either. Now let's look at the issue of visa bonds. The US authorities have said that the bonds ranging from US 5,000 to US 15,000 on B1, B2 visa applicants are being instituted on citizens from Antigua and Dominica. And the reason is to curb overstays in the US of visa holders from these islands among the other islands that were also placed on that visa bond list. The amount is to be determined at the time of interview. A bond does not guarantee visa issuance. If someone pays the fees without a consular office's direction, the fees will not be refunded. If, however, the application is successful, said bonds will be reimbursed if travelers have not overstayed in the US. Those who overstay, as well as those who choose to remain in the US indefinitely or apply to adjust non-immigrant status, including claiming asylum, will forfeit these bond payments. The bond will be cancelled and the money returned in the following situations: if the Department of Homeland Security records the visa holder's departure from the United States on or before the date to which they are authorized to stay in the US, or the visa holder does not travel to the US before the expiration of the visa, or if the visa holder applies for and is denied admission at the US port of entries. Further to that, individuals entering the US on these bonded visas are mandated to enter and leave the US at the following designated ports of entry and exit: Boston Logan International Airport, John F. Kennedy International Airport, Washington Dulles International Airport. This is very restrictive because individuals seeking to travel to elsewhere have to use these designated airports to make their way wherever else they are going. So booking arrangements have to be made to accommodate traveling to these airports, even if these are not the destinations of the intended travel. Looking at statistics for overstays in the US for each of the Caribbean islands in 2023, the islands of Haiti, Jamaica, Guyana, Dominican Republic all had higher overstay percentages than the OECS countries of Dominica and Antigua. Now, I'm not advocating that these islands be added to the list as well, but merely pointing to the obvious deception in the US's claim that the reason for the bonds is to curb overstays. It is no coincidence, too, that this is happening to countries with CBI programs that are also ALBA associated, have diplomatic relations with Venezuela and also China. The latter, which is a major trading partner of the US, but more than that, at the same time, a juxtaposed adversary, bought into a race for dominance in the world of economics and geopolitics, with great interest in the Western Hemisphere, which includes the Caribbean basin, and interest in some of those very small islands. This is magnified in the fact that the Trump administration, after arresting Nicolas Maduro, made a few demands of Venezuela's interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, to include kicking out and severing ties with China, as well as with Cuba, Iran, and Russia, some of those countries that these islands do also have diplomatic relations with. The US, on economically vulnerable small islands, is clearly using the big stick policy, with carrots hanging from said stick. It is also true that the governance policies of these islands have some common thread. Common too, as we've observed from communiques from the respective leaders, read the islands' troubles and the wordings of their respective speeches, very identical in their responses to actions taken by the Trump administration pre and post the Maduro arrest. In reacting to the arrest of Maduro, the prime ministers of both Barbados and Dominica echoed that both Venezuela and the US are friends of their respective countries, a departure from their posture previously, where only Trinidad out of CARICOM stood supposedly as a US friend. The islands have been heavily dependent on the US, not just for visa travel, scholarships for youth, for education, or aid for sports, but for trade, and the fact that a large percentage of the imports from the US for those islands, come from the US. Never before too has many islands in the OACS been simultaneously in the news as it relates to punitive actions being taken by the US against them. But never before too have we had in office a leader like the current US president. The repercussions of failing to comply with US demands stand to impact heavily the economies of all four countries, Antigua, Dominica, St. Kitts, and Grenada. More than that, bowing to the dictates of the US is not only a blow to sovereignty, but the fact that these leaders could make such unilateral decisions under US pressure is not a good look for their respective democracies either, where citizens have not had a say on any of these issues that stand to impact them. Is this a breaking point for the respective administrations of these islands, or will there be a paradigm shift in governance and policies of the incumbents? Will the US be satisfied with the conditions they have set, and how will the island citizens be impacted by the same? Maybe it's time to start looking beyond to forging new relationships, perhaps with the African continent. Only time will tell what's next, and so we wait and see. This brings us to the end of today's podcast. Until next time, have a blessed day all.